So welcome everyone. We are waiting for a few others, but we'll begin. Thank you so much. Well, it's a wet Monday morning here in Melbourne, but thank you so much for giving up the next half an hour of your time. We are going to gallop through, obviously. Storytelling is a huge topic, but we're going to give you as much information as we can in the next 30 minutes. You will receive the slides, and we also will send a recording, so you don't need to write anything down that's on the slides. There will be time for questions at the end, and if you really want to ask a question as you go, just type something in the chat box and Simon can address that at the end. Yeah, but if it's a burning question, then you could ask it if it's burning. Anyway, I'll hand over to Simon. He's probably going to start with a story because he's a storyteller. So I'm Hayley Cavill. Thanks so much. I'll come back in at the end. But here is Simon Oates. Thank you.
Thank you, Hayley. Hello, welcome everyone. Yes, I'm Simon Oates. I am a storyteller, and I'm going to begin by telling you about how when I was 19 years old, I set my face on fire. True story. At the time, I was training to be an actor at one of the top drama schools in Melbourne, and so I had visions of fame and fortune, and mostly self-centered stuff driving that. And I knew also that actors needed to skill up because it's an industry here, at least, that has 98% unemployment at any given time. So I thought I'm going to need to skill up here, and I had a friend who was called Nick the barman, who one night over a drink revealed to me that he knew the secrets of fire breathing because he'd trained in circus skills. And so I thought, this is it. This is exactly what I need. I will be the fire breathing actor and get lots of work on that basis. So one night, Nick came round to the share house I was living at at the time, and he had in his hand a big leather bag, and out of this he pulled a litre of shellite petroleum and some sticks with cloth at the end of them, and he proceeded to teach me how to fire swallow, how to put the burning liquid into your mouth and close your lips around it, which went very well, which meant that we could go on to stage 2, which was learning to take the liquid in your mouth, breathe it out so it caught fire and fireballed. Well, when I had my go at this, out came the fire and back came the wind with the fire, and it blew the burning liquid all over my face. I ran straight for the bathroom. I remember turning around to see Nick throwing his leather jacket, which he'd wrapped around my head, onto the ground to put out the burning flames. I got into the bathroom, looked at my face in the mirror to see the skin starting to peel away, and immediately filled the sink, plunged my face in. It was a bit of adventure getting to the hospital. I spent a weekend on morphine, and then I had 3 weeks recuperating at home with a scab from my forehead to my chin, wondering what on earth I was going to do with myself now that I didn't have a face. Well, as you can probably see, over time my face healed, but in the meantime I actually started to ask myself some more important questions about what I might be able to contribute to the world. And over the next few years I started to find my way into storytelling, into volunteering for organisations doing social good, and eventually, about 5 years ago, I put them together with the new breaking science of storytelling to start to work initially with non-profits about how to share the stories of doing good things in the world. And that's what brings me in front of you today. So today we're going to do a whirlwind tour through the science of storytelling and why it is critical at this point in time when you are working in CSR and social good to tell the good stories of the work you're doing. So get the slides moving. Some of my clients there, and here is the main reason why it is critical. Millennials, these people are your customers. They are increasingly going to be your customers into the future, and they are also your staff, your employees. And if you're not recruiting and retaining millennials, then your company only has so long to live, as we all know. Tomorrow, Hayley Cavill will be giving a webinar in which there will be much more information on millennials, but I'm going to tick off the few critical points from the storytelling point of view about why we need storytelling to engage them. So millennials as a group, we know from the research, are sick to death of institutional scandals, and they are frightened about the future, and they feel that not enough is being done to address society's problems, and in particular climate change. So the research tells us that 1 in 5 Australians in 2018 actively boycotted businesses and brands based on bad corporate behaviour. We know that 2/3 of millennials fundamentally believe that companies' only ambition is profit. On the other side of that, the opportunity that we have is the research says that 3/4 of Australian millennials believe that corporations have the potential to solve society's most pressing problems. Millennials, as we know, are armed with an infinite array of apps, platforms. They are masters of social media, and they are fantastic at sharing stories, both the negative and the positive stories. Here's what they want from you as companies. They want you to stop plundering the earth, assuming that you already are, own up and fix the problems. They want you to be human. They want you to take a stand for something, and they want you ultimately to be a force for good. So you have a choice. As we will see in the webinar, the brain thinks in stories. And great stories are based on polarities. Your choice is to be a CSR hero or a corporate villain. And in a way, you don't have a choice, because if you're not putting forward the story of the good work that you are doing, we already have a story about corporations and big business in our brain. And in that story, you are the villain. That's the default. That's what the research tells us. So, let's assume that you've already started. You are living the good story. You're doing the good work. You're doing social good. And now the big mistake that's going on is that not enough corporates are telling the story in a way that gets across, that is meaningful, is emotional, engages people, and moves them to change their behavior. And what we know is that stats and information are not going to cut it. It has to be emotional, and it has to be compelling to cut through. So there's a big buzz about storytelling, as we all know, and that's great, and telling good stories is the way to go. But what makes for a good story? How do you know what is a good story? How do you know which is the right story to engage your audience? Well, in order to look at this, we have to go to the science. And here's where we're very blessed, is that in the last 10 years in particular, science has emerged that can talk to us about exactly what stories are and how they work in the brain of your audience. So we're going to start here. We are going to start with possibly the simplest little animation you have ever seen. I just want you to take a look at this. It's about 1.5 minutes long. There's no sound, so don't go checking problems with your sound. And at the end, we'll just have a little chat about it. Relax and enjoy. That's it. So maybe you want to punch something in the chat box now. What did you see? We'll take take any feedback here. What did you see? So while people are typing, I can tell you, having screened this video in workshops many, many times, the classic things that people see here are stories of things like playground bullying, domestic violence, two ganging up on one. People see the big, large outline square as a house or a hut or a room. The big triangle is often seen as an aggressor, with the poor little triangle and the circle as in a relationship together, trying to flee from the big bully. So what all of those things have in common, yes, we have the big triangle made friends, come out to play, lost his friends and got angry. Yeah. We see relationships, we see intentions, we see characters, locations. All of these things are the basic building blocks of stories. Now, what interests me about this is that occasionally people will report back that they didn't see any of that. They just saw geometric shapes moving around a blank screen. But it's the exception to the rule. For most of us, once we start to compute what's going on there, we get a story. And most people will report back that the process of that story unfolding inside the mind felt effortless. You don't have to consciously make up the story. Now, this comes from an experiment done in the 1940s by two psychologists, Heider and Simmel, where they showed this to participants and asked them essentially what I asked you. What did you see? And their findings were that what stories are something that is going on all the time in our minds. So, this is a natty little thing called the story influence equation, or the radicalization potential equation. It comes from a body of research being done by DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency in the US, which is essentially the research wing of the Pentagon. You might know them from such hits as the internet and artificial intelligence. They have been pouring billions of dollars into research over the past 6 years in particular to understand the process of story inside the mind. And the radicalization potential equation might give you a clue as to why. But what it says is that DARPA believes that with 80% accuracy, using their story influence equation or radicalization potential equation, they can predict the likelihood of a given story to influence the behavior of a target audience. That is based on the research that I'm going to scoot you through. So the science tells us that what story is not primarily something that we tell or share with each other, it's the way we think. It is the primary structure our brains use to select from all the information that we're bombarded with for what is emotionally relevant to us to create memories. Paul Zak, who is one of the scientists working on this project for DARPA and also the director of the Center for Neuroeconomics, he studies empathy, and in particular the neurochemistry of empathy. And his research, where you'll see there's a link to a fabulous YouTube there, has shown that storytelling, powerful stories, release two primary chemicals in the brain: cortisol and oxytocin. Cortisol being what focuses our attention, and oxytocin being the bonding chemical, the chemical that is underneath the experience of empathy and human bonding. And Paul Zak has said from his research that great stories change behavior by changing brain chemistry. So from other research, here's what we see. Why doesn't information and facts engage people? Because if you put people in fMRI scanners, brain scanners, and then you give them information, pure data-based information, what they found is you get activity in two primary parts of the brain. Broca's area, which is about processing language, Wernicke's area, which is about language comprehension. I call them the professors of the brain. They're the bits that go, ah, yes, I understand what you mean. Okay, but as we know, professors don't tend to get active in the world. Mostly they're seeking tenure and a comfortable chair that they can sit in and explore their own fascinations. Apologies to any professors out there. Here's what we see when you put someone under a brain scanner and then give them similar information in the format of an emotionally engaging story. You can see once again the professors are there, recognizing what they're hearing, but we're also getting activity all through the sensory cortex of the brain, the parts of the brain that process sights, sounds, movement, touch, color and shape. And critically, they're the same parts of the brain that are activated if you are actually having this experience yourself. So stories are activating your brain as if you are there and it's happening to you. Now, when this activity is going on in the brain and we have this sense that we're there, it's happening to us, then we get the critical chemical activity in the center of the brain. You can see the red circle there. In the hypothalamus, we have the release of cortisol and oxytocin. This is the central part of the brain that is like the old reptilian brain, you know, the limbic system, these areas where they govern behavior, motivation, and critically emotion. You cannot get one without the other. Facts will speak to the part of the brain that is the professor. We can understand and comprehend what you say, but if you don't move me emotionally, I will not act on your message, and also I'm very unlikely to remember it, let alone pass it on to someone else. So here I'm going to give you my model, a simple model for what makes the essential elements of a compelling story. And by that I mean a story that speaks to the brain and activates it in this way. We use the word story for all kinds of things. When I talk about story, I am talking about something that engages, creates emotion, and potentially moves people to action. And here's the elements of that. Firstly, a story has a protagonist. Protagonist is a fancy theatrical word or writer's word for the main character of a story. Why do I use it? Because it has a really lovely origin. It comes from two old Greek words, proto and agonista, meaning the first struggler. The agonistas were the wrestlers in the old arenas of ancient Greece. So the word tells us that it is about the primary person who is struggling or wrestling with something. Critically, a protagonist is an individual. You cannot tell a compelling emotional story about an organization or a board. You have to choose an individual from whose point of view you tell the story, and we empathize, identify with them and empathize with them as they go through the story. Any story can be told from different points of view with different protagonists. One of the keys to compelling storytelling is finding the right protagonist for your target audience. Second, as I said, the protagonist must struggle. Now, if you are at the beginning of a CSR or social good journey in your organization, fantastic. You don't have to be at the completion of it with lots of runs on the board to start to tell us your story, because we are interested in this. We are interested in humans taking vulnerable steps, being courageous, and struggling against difficult odds. That's what switches our brain on. The bulk of your storytelling needs to reside here. It's not about the triumphs, it's about the difficult things that you overcame. If you want to see this in action, look no further than J.K. Rowling's work, Harry Potter. You will find that in those enormous books, most of the time you are struggling along with Harry as he valiantly tries to overcome completely unfair odds that are thrown at him from all directions. That is the stuff that elicits cortisol and oxytocin in our brain, the struggles as we empathize along. A story must have a concrete goal. There needs to be something tangible that the protagonist is striving for so that we can barrack for them and we know whether they arrive at that goal or fail. And it must have a resolution. We need to know what happens. Does the protagonist achieve the goal? Do they fail? And critically, how do they feel about that? In the research, this is called the residual resolution emotion, which really just means how does the protagonist feel at the end of the story, because that is how the audience will feel. If they've been empathizing along, they're left with a feeling. And that is what triggers the likelihood of action. And finally, and most importantly, and this is where I see storytelling going wrong all the time. Stories must be told through details, specific, concrete, sensory images. Stories are not told in conceptual overviews of a period of time. They must be told in specific details about specific moments in time. This is what activates the sensory areas of the brain, the sensory cortex. And when we activate that, we get what is called the transportation effect, where I forget about my actual surroundings and I'm transported into the orally told story, the movie, the Netflix episode, and for a time I forget who I am and where I am, and I sort of become the protagonist of the story, engaged in the valiant struggles. The transportation effect is what unlocks the emotional part of the brain and the chemical changes that potentially create changes of behavior in your audience. Where do you start with good storytelling? The same place you start with all good communication with your audience. You need to know who you're talking to. You need to know what's going to be relevant to them. You need to know critically what they value, what they're emotionally attached to, but also you need to know what's the story they already have in their mind. Because remember, the brain is always telling itself stories, and there is an old and increasing story about big business and corporations, and it's not one that you would want them to be telling themselves about you. But if you don't know what the story is that's already in the landscape of their mind, how can you tell the compelling, engaging story that is going to oust that negative story and put your social good story in its place? And here's the benchmark. The storytelling landscape is changing. Here's what you're up against. The new story. There's a darkness in our world. 1 billion people live in extreme poverty. It's made darker by the fact that in this same world, extreme consumerism exists. Each day as consumers, we give billions of dollars to the world's largest multinationals for everyday products. Together, we think it's time to bring the light. This is from the About Us page of Thank You. It's social enterprises that are engaging millennials, that are meeting the kind of values that they want to see from big organizations in the world. That is the landscape we're in. If you are not telling a compelling, epic story, you will ultimately lose market share to people who are, and who are putting that compelling story right up front. So I want to return to this. Once again, my challenge to you is, are you going to be a CSR hero or a corporate villain? And if you're already taking the steps to become a CSR hero, then you need to learn the skills and practice the art of telling that story in compelling ways to move your audience so that it's known. There's no point doing the good work unless people know about it. So I'm going to hand back over to Hayley. We'll have some questions first, though. So we do. We have a few minutes for some questions. If you want to punch it into the chat box. Oop. Here we go. Just waiting to see if anyone has any questions at this point. No. So I will be teaching full-day workshops in CSR storytelling and social good storytelling for corporates and also for communications professionals in Melbourne, Sydney and Brisbane. And what I'll be teaching on those days is how to find and share stories that speak directly to the kind of core beliefs and values of your target audience. I'm going to teach you how to use my story spine template, which is a very powerful tool for analyzing how the stories that you're working with connect with audience beliefs and values, communicate your key messaging, and critically change behavior. I'll also be taking a look at the hero's journey, Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, which is a powerful model for telling the big story of your CSR journey. And if you haven't already purchased Talking the Walk 2, which is Hayley Cavill's recently released fabulous book on how to tell your social good story to resonate with millennials. You need to purchase that straight away. It's full of fabulous research, and also she talks a lot about this model of the hero's journey. So we'll look at how can you apply that effectively. And we will also talk about such things as how to tell the stories and provide platforms for the beneficiaries of the social good you're doing, and where your organisation needs to be positioned in those stories. So if there's no questions at this point, I'm going to hand over to Hayley to wrap it up. I hope you've got something of value today, and yes, do the good work, tell the good stories.
Great, thank you. Thanks, everyone. So here's the next slide. Here we go. We're going to be just running one workshop in Melbourne, Sydney and Brisbane on these dates. The lovely people at Westpac, who both Simon and I have worked with in their foundation and their social, what do they call them? The
Social Change Fellows.
Social Change Fellows. So we've worked with them in that area, and they love the work that Simon is bringing to both the corporate and the non-profit sector. So they've agreed to host these workshops in each state. So it's a full-day workshop with Simon and I. He's just explained what you're going to get from those workshops. They will fill up. The last time we ran this, we were oversubscribed. So if it speaks to you and you'd like to come and learn, we would really love corporates to bring their agencies with them, because obviously it's important that any communications firms that you're working with come along. And for those of you online who are an agency, then bring your clients along. There is a very special discount for people who register 2 people at the same time. So does anyone have any questions about that? No? I know it's a Monday morning. You're all a bit quiet today. It's a fascinating area. I have to say, when I was writing Talking the Walk, there were a couple of key things that kept coming up, and I evaluated over 40 research reports to write the book, from Edelman through to Havas Media, Cone Communications. I read numerous reports, corporate social responsibility reports, sustainability reports, and the one thing that became evident to me is that corporates who are on the CSR path and are doing fantastic work are just throwing money down the drain, because they're just not communicating in a way that's landing with millennials. And that's why I've focused quite extensively on storytelling in the book. So for those people on the webinar, you will receive the slides, and you will also receive a special booklet that we've put together for you, which covers the hero's journey. Which gives a little bit more context to how beautifully aligned a CSR story is when you look at the hero's journey, which we will talk more about in the workshop. And the one mistake that people make is, corporates particularly, they just assume that they're the hero, and of course they're not the hero. The customer's the hero, or the staff is the hero, or the people that you're working with, your beneficiaries of your activities, are the hero. So I'll send all of that to you in a moment. Does anyone have any questions before we go? No? Lovely. All right, well, I will bid you farewell. Have a great week, and start listening for stories. Great, thank you so much, Simon.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me, Hayley.
Okay, bye everyone. Bye.